Good evening and welcome everyone to our February Black Country Society virtual heritage meeting. I'm Andrew Homer and I'm going to be chairing for this evening. I must say it's really great to see how our numbers are expanding monthly with both regulars and new members. Where I am just outside of Tavistock, our wild ducks have just returned to the pond, so it's a sure sign that spring is at least on the way, I hope. The regulars will know that we take it in turns to chair these meetings. So tonight we have Chris Baker handling the technical side. Ward Jones will be chairing the questions and comments at the end of our talk. Bear with me a second. These can be put into the chat if you want to as we go along, or wait until the end of the talk, of course. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. Please keep your microphones turned off. The talks themselves are recorded, and this one will appear in due course on the Black Country Society website. Now, before I introduce Dr. Malcolm Dick, I'm going to hand over to Chris Baker, who has some news about next month's virtual event. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Andrew. I hope you can all hear me. Is that okay, Andrew? Am I coming?
Yes, fine.
Very briefly, I just want to talk about next month's meeting. It's going to be different in some ways. The first difference is that it will actually be on a Wednesday night, Wednesday, March the 26th. The second difference is that it will include the Society Annual General Meeting. And so the meeting, the AGM will start at 7:30. The meeting itself, the presentation, sometime around 8 or 8:15. The third difference is that it will be a hybrid meeting, which means that it will be streamed from Boulton Town Hall, where the AGM is happening in person. So there's going to be all sorts of potential entertainment. You can log on to watch the technology fall apart, but we hope it will work. We will see. The presentation will be by me, on the basis that at the AGM you get a member of the committee to do it who doesn't mind being told that he can't talk too long. The presentation, for those of you who've been around from the start of the Virtual Heritage Group, will be a sort of repeat of the first one, an ecclesiastical affair all about errant clergymen in the Black Country, but that's more later. It won't be quite the same. I've got more salacious details to share since I gave it first time around. Do come along. One thing I would say, though, and this is for some of you quite important, there are a number of you who always ask for the link on the day of the meeting, even on the evening of the meeting, even some of you after 7 o'clock in the evening of the meeting. Next time, the last chance that you'll get of getting the link is if you contact me on the night before, because on the day I will be either busy or I'll be travelling to Boulton Town Hall from where I live in Rutland. So if you try to get the link for the meeting on the day itself, you are, I'm afraid, going to be terribly disappointed next time round. That's me, Andrew, so I hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Malcolm Dick. Malcolm is chairman of the Black Country Society, as many of you will know, and honorary associate professor at the University of Birmingham. He's written widely on the history of the region and was director of the Centre for West Midlands History and convener of the very successful MA in West Midlands History at the university, which many of us, myself included, have benefited tremendously from. In 2019, he was awarded an OBE for services to history in the West Midlands. His most recent book on the region is The Black Country, A History in 100 Objects, which focuses, 100 objects. And I missed a little bit there. He's currently working on a website project which is focusing on the history of local buildings. So without any further ado, over to Dr. Malcolm Dick and James Keir, 1785 to 1820, Innovation, the Lunar Society, and Inventing the Black Country.
Very much indeed, Andrew. I can't think of any connections between your Tavistock Ducks and James Keir, but we'll see what transpires. Um, I suppose I'm being heard loud and clear. Good. Yes, people are nodding.
Yes, that's
That's fine.
absolutely fine, Malcolm.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm looking at James Keir. My thoughts keep evolving. Some of you might have heard earlier versions of this talk. But if we can move on, and there's a couple of images of Keir coming up next, which we can go over very quickly. That's a print. And the next one is a portrait, which was, in inverted commas, discovered by a PhD student. It's a lovely image. It makes Keir look like a kindly gentleman. That's his daughter he's conversing with or smiling at. Those of you who know Jenny Uglow's book on the Lunar Society will know that Jenny actually, when asked which member of the Lunar Society would she most like to talk to, and she always said James Keir. And maybe as I go through today's presentation, you will get some sort of sense as to his personality and why he might have been a rather nicer person, perhaps, than one or two of the other prima donnas who were members of the Lunar Society. But let's move on to the next image. This is the structure of my talk. I'm going to go through most of these points very quickly. Really 8 points: overview, biography, environment and cultural milieu, so you can understand the circumstances in which he's operating. James Keir has been neglected. In many ways, he was important to some of the better known individuals like Wedgwood and Boulton and Watt, but I'll explain the neglect. And then I'll look at some of his contributions to innovation in industry. And I'm going to focus particularly on his contribution to the Black Country in his mineralogy of the southwest part of Staffordshire, looking broadly at Keir and the Lunar Society, and then finally at legacy. So let us move through. Normally, Keir is portrayed as a secondary figure in the Midlands Enlightenment, or Midlands Industrial Enlightenment, which is a term historians have started to use to look at the sort of connections between thinking and doing in the West Midlands. There's several reasons why he is portrayed as a secondary or tertiary figure. But in reality, I would argue he was a highly significant applied scientist, industrialist, and promoter of economic development, and he stands comparison with other individuals within the Lunar Society. I would like to note, from the point of view of this audience, he lived in the Black Country for much of his adult life. So he deserves to be sort of described as a Black Country figure. And in particular, in relation to that, I'm going to say he invented the concept of an industrial Black Country before the term was invented. When Keir was alive, the term Black Country wasn't used. It wasn't widely used until the 1830s and 1840s. There's some debate about when the term first came into discourse. But let's look at his biography so you can understand where he's coming from. He was Scottish, born in Stirlingshire, pretty affluent gentry background. He studied medicine at Edinburgh, and that's where he met Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, another leading member of the Lunar Society. And it was Darwin who really invited him to the West Midlands. He joined the army for reasons we are not quite sure why. And he went for some time to the Caribbean. He didn't like the army. He didn't like sort of socializing with his fellow officers, who who would spend their time whining and wenching, I think one can say. And he would rather spend his time reading the classics. And I suppose that's not an activity that one associates with 18th century army officers. So it's a slightly odd career. Maybe he just wanted to see the world. But he resigned, invited by Darwin. He moved to the West Midlands. He married there. And while he was still a relatively young man, he published his translation of a dictionary of chemistry, which is a very impressive publication. He also entered manufacturing, began to manufacture glass in Stourbridge, and he managed on behalf of Boulton and Watt for a while, the Soho Works. If we move on to the next set of dates, his inventions were certainly there. Perhaps one of his most important inventions was that he patented a new alloy called El Dorado, which of course refers to this city of gold. It wasn't a new form of gold. It was a metal that could be forged cold. A bit more about that later. In the 1780s, he established the enormous Tipton Chemical Works with an army friend of his, Alexander Blair. 1791, he wasn't a participant in the priestly rites, but he actually chaired the meeting that was the occasion when the priestly rites began. He was a supporter, at least intellectually, of the French Revolution. He did change his thinking into the 1800s. He also purchased a colliery at Tividale, essentially to support his chemical works. But one of the key things I'm going to focus upon is a remarkable publication of his Mineralogy of the Southwest part of Staffordshire, which is published in a history. You might think that's quite odd, in Stebbing Shaw's History and Antiquities of Staffordshire. But actually a lot of contemporary histories contained contemporary studies, so it wasn't necessarily unusual. Stebbing Shaw's History is a very interesting publication in 2 volumes, but it's a bit of a hodgepodge of essays. In 1801, his interest in education was shown when he dictated his dialogues on chemistry between his father and daughter to his daughter Amelia. This publication was never published, so it survives in manuscript. And then if we move on to the final biography, set of biographical details, can move on. Yes. Yes. His concern with the sort of degeneration, if you like, of the French Revolution into military dictatorship led to him writing a pamphlet when he was concerned about the invasion of Great Britain by French, calling for a formation of local militia. In the 1800s, his health wasn't brilliant. He suffered from rheumatism, and it's often suggested he got dementia as well. And he suffered in 1807 when his home at Hilltop in West Bromwich was burnt down, which destroyed a lot of his archives, his letters. He then went to live with his daughter in Worcestershire, Aberley Hall. Aberley Hall is now a school. The original building partially survives. And when Boulton died, he was asked by Boulton's son to write a celebration of his father. But he was very critical of Boulton. More about that later. He handed over the Tipton works to Blair, and he died at Aberley Hall aged 85 in 1820. So that's the biography from Scotland to the West Midlands, and he did quite a lot within his orbit. What shaped Keir? Well, a number of things. First of all, he'd had an extensive classical education, and he could translate from Latin. I'm not sure whether he could translate from Greek into English. The philosophy he was particularly committed to was one of Stoicism. Not many members of the Lunar Society were Stoics. They were prima donnas. So what we can say is that this helped to sustain him, and it helped to shape his way in which he viewed the world. Another thing that shaped him, and this would be his time at Edinburgh University as well, was the Scottish Enlightenment, which we seem to remember rather more than the West Midlands Enlightenment, which saw the marriage of theory and practice. You know, Watt was a creature, if you like, of the Scottish Enlightenment, as was Adam Smith. And Keir was part of that culture. Someone who was an intellectual, but someone who his later life showed was very interested in doing things. The American historian Joel Mokyr has talked about the marriage of theory and practice by referring to two types of individuals, often in the same person, the savants and fabricants, the thinkers and doers. So Keir was very much part of the Scottish Enlightenment. I don't know whether something has come up over the screen. Right, it's going now. That's fine. Like other members of the Lunar Society, he had a medical training. Medical training gave you a scientific training, although the word scientific wasn't used in the 18th century. So other members of the Lunar Society, like William Small, Erasmus Darwin, and William Withering, were also trained doctors. So it introduced them to the wider world of what we would call science. Another influence was the Lunar Society, his friendship and scientific links with other individuals, Darwin, Wedgwood, and Watt in particular. And another influence, we would say, was actually where Keir was living, the West Midlands, which I've described before as the Silicon Valley of the United Kingdom, where invention, innovation, and rapid industrial growth were combined. And Keir was part of that. And Keir very much was exploiting opportunities in the Black Country, or what we would call the Black Country. So that's the environment and cultural milieu in which Keir was living. But Keir, as I was suggested before, has been neglected compared with other lunar men. One of the reasons being is that we don't have many primary sources surviving. We have a number of his publications, including things he wrote for the Royal Society. But because of a fire at his house in Hilltop and a second fire at his daughter's house in Aberley, you had a double whammy when it came to sources. So we don't have many letters, and we don't have a family archive. One of the advantages for people like Boulton, Watt, and Wedgwood is that you have these massive family archives compiled by their children and grandchildren to celebrate the names of the great men. Keir didn't have that. Another point about the neglect was that I was hinting at before, his personality. He wasn't an extrovert in the same way as, well, Watt wasn't an extrovert. The same way, say, that Boulton or Wedgwood or even Priestley were extroverts. Keir was stoical. He didn't like show. The Black Country historian Chris Upton, who unfortunately died a few years ago, some of you will know some of his work, said the complexity of his science is a reason. I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not a scientist, but I don't think his science is any more complicated than other individuals at the time. The fourth point is the lack of memorialization. There are no statues to Keir. There's no gravestone. In fact, he left strict instructions that there should be no memorial. There's been a very limited amount of secondary writing about Keir. There's a sort of very small booklet, little more than a booklet, produced by two historians in the 1960s. Been a few articles. I wrote one, but more importantly, more recently, there's been a PhD thesis by the Canadian scholar Christian Schrantz, who's done more than anyone to draw attention to Keir and his importance. She did a remarkable amount of research to uncover aspects of his work and made contact with his members of his surviving family, not direct descendants, but people who had many of his artifacts, including paintings. Right, we'll move on to the next theme. There's a few themes I'm going to explore to look at his significance as what we would call a scientist and as an industrialist. One was his work on theoretical chemistry, his translation of Pierre-Joseph Macquer's Dictionary of Chemistry. Keir's dictionary, which was essentially a translation, was published a few years after Macquer's, but it contained a large number of annotations, which actually made connections with rather more of the real world than perhaps Macquer's did. And it was a handbook that often industrialists used if they wanted to find out about chemical reactions or substances. And there are versions of it subsequently published. That would be his major work of science. In terms of industry, there was glass making. He leased a glass house in Amblecote near Stourbridge, making window glass, chemical wares and wine glasses. And he wrote about his work. It wasn't just a glass house that made stuff. It is a glass house where he experimented with making glass, and he corresponded with Wedgwood about a number of the things he was making. And he wrote about the process of crystallization in the Royal Society transactions. If we move on to the second theme, I've got a number of possible, I'll put it no more strongly than that, images of Keir's glass house in Amblecote. In Derby Museum and Art Gallery, there are two paintings is the wrong word, sort of pen and ink drawings or washes, watercolors, you might say, by Joseph Wright of Derby. And that's the first one. And there's a second one in the next image, which you can see. I don't think sorry, that's not Joseph Wright. That's a sort of more conventional image of a glass house, a rather bigger one. But if we can go back to the Joseph Wright image, if we can go back to that, the assumption is by scholars that this is Keir's glass house. Wright knew members of the Lunar Society, stayed with Erasmus Darwin, his good friend of Wedgwood, and he would almost certainly, travelling out with Darwin or travelling out with other members of the Lunar Society, he almost certainly would have met with Keir. And because Wright was very interested in industrial premises, the supposition is very much that this was the interior of Keir's glass house. Not a very large one, but I'm not sure there's a lot of conclusions to draw from this, but at any rate, it probably is, but I'm not going to put it more strongly than that. James Keir's glasshouse. Next image, move on to the next image. What about other things? Well, I mentioned El Dorado. He was very interested in metallurgy or metallurgy. That's where his interest in chemistry would be very important. He made various experiments with copper-plated iron, and he took out his patent for El Dorado for an alloy of copper, zinc, and iron, which could be forged cold. And he hoped it would be used by the Navy for bolts, nails, and sheathing. If it was, he would have made a package. This is a time when the British Navy was expanding rapidly. However, the Navy did not adopt it, but El Dorado was used for glazing. If you move on to the next image, we'll see an example. In Soho House. Many of you will have been to Soho House. Essentially, it's closed at the moment. But the image after that shows one of the skylights at Soho House, which is incorporates, or we're almost certain it incorporates Keir's El Dorado. And Kristen Schrantz, a Canadian PhD student, tried to do a number of explorations of buildings with some success, where she was pretty certain that El Dorado was used in fanlights. So there you've got a sort of highly decorative example of the metal in one of Keir's lunar colleagues. Next slide. Keir also, as well as engaging in glassmaking and metallurgy, engaged in industrial chemistry, experiment in developing alkali for bleaching and soap making. And together with his army friend, Alexander Blair, he began making alkali from potash and soda at Tipton. This was an enormous concern, which was established to make demand for soap. Keir discouraged visitors. We have very, very few descriptions of that chemical works, unfortunately, and we have virtually no images of it. The next image, it's from the 19th century, so it's almost 100 years later. But of course, one of the reasons why he established his chemical works was the availability of canals. So he could move his raw materials and his finished products readily. But the next image provides an illustration. This is in Staffordshire Archives, a map of Keir's chemical works. I'm not going to worry about deconstructing it. You can see the Birmingham Canal scooping round on the left-hand side and bottom of the map. And the red buildings refer to some of Keir's structures. It was a very, very large site. It doesn't survive, unsurprisingly. Next slide, please. Now, I was very interested in Keir's chemical works, not least because there was so little we know about it. But another associate of the Lunar Society, Anna Seward, the Swan of Lichfield, a poet, friend of Erasmus Darwin, and she knew other members of the Lunar Society, including Boulton and Wedgwood. She wrote what I think is quite a remarkable poem called Coalbrookdale in 1785. She's the first person in Britain to use the word pollution in which we use it to refer to environmental pollution. Beforehand, it tended to be used to refer to sort of sexual pollution, rape and so on. It appears in Milton's Comus. Coalbrookdale is slightly modelled on Milton's Comus. But there's an interesting passage in Coalbrookdale where Seward comments on the impact of chemists upon the environment. Seward didn't like how industry was damaging the environment. She's one of the earliest persons, certainly in the Midlands, to draw attention to the effect of pollution. And there's just a brief extract here. So with intent transmutant, chemists bruise the shrinking leaves and flowers, whose steam saline, congealing swift on the recipient's sides, shoot into crystals, and the night frost thus insidious, creeping on the watery plain, wave after wave encrusts, till liquid change to solid and support the volant foot. It's not great poetry, but it's interesting poetry. And there she's talking, I would suggest, at chemical fumes or chemical deposits damaging the environment. She herself suffered from asthma, so she's very sort of sensitive to atmospheric pollution, as she says on various occasions. But this is a sort of rare comment. We don't see very many comments like this. And certainly Keir doesn't comment about pollution, and neither do the other major industrialists in the Lunar Society, or indeed in a widespread way throughout late 18th century Britain. Next slide. Another aspect, yet another aspect in which Keir was involved was coal mining and geology. 1794, Blair and Keir purchased Tividale colliery, which provided coal for the Tipton works, and this was important, an opportunity for Keir to enhance his knowledge of mineralogy and geology. And this relates to the publication I'll be referring to shortly. And that provided a major intellectual link with Boulton, James Watt and James Watt Jr., who were also very interested in geology, as indeed Wedgwood was. This was one of the major themes of individuals in the Lunar Society. They'd go out exploring in Derbyshire and delve down into the caverns. But you could go down a coal mine in Tividale and also see a geological strata. Next slide, please. But one of the things I want to focus on in particular is one of Keir's interesting publications, The Mineralogy of the Southwest Part of Staffordshire and Stebbingshaw's History and Antiquities of Staffordshire, which I've mentioned before. That was a history in 2 volumes. You can still buy copies of that if you want to fork out sort of several £1,000s. Beyond my pay grade, I'm afraid. But this is a lengthy essay. It's a very readable essay. It isn't. It doesn't include sort of complex science, if science is complex. It wasn't like a Royal Society paper. It was designed for a lay audience. And essentially what we have there is a survey of the economic importance of the Black Country, covering mineral resources, transport, canals, that is, industrial and labour specialisation, the family and economy of nail making. Now, Keir, I would argue, invented the Black Country. He's the first person to talk about the Black Country as an economic entity before the term was widely used. Okay, next slide. What Keir's mineralogy does in particular, it's a set of observations, a set of descriptions, and a set of explanations. And he was aware of the potential of industrial southwest Staffordshire for the future. And he drew attention in particular to the significance of the famous 30-foot seam, which was pretty well known at the time, at least amongst those who knew about the geology of the Black Country. Next slide. The mineralogy was an industrial geography and geology. When I first used it, it read very much as if it was something that was produced in the 20th century. It's almost a contemporary source. It uses facts, it uses tables, it uses statistics, and it refers to other studies. So in some respects, it's like a paper. He also used words such as valuable, prosperity, extensive, and remarkable. So it wasn't just a scientific survey, there were value judgments, which showed that he was impressed by the importance of the Black Country as a contributor to economic life. It was, though, a scientific survey in the way in which we might understand it, with practical information for an entrepreneur who wanted to invest or trade. So, if we like, we can say it uncovered the surface of the Black Country and showed its potential for development. Next slide. In the mineralogy, Keir revealed the intricate links between geology, industry, and wealth, with a few quotations of valuable mines of coal, ironstone, limestone, and clay, contributed to the various and extensive trades of the area. Now, he's referring to the four main products you dig out of the ground, and which form the prosperity of the expanding towns. He would see Birmingham as part of the Black Country. He wasn't the only person, but Birmingham, Dudley, Wednesbury, Walsall, and Bilston, Wolverhampton, and Stourbridge. Of course, as I said before, the term Black Country wasn't used, but he's seeing these entities as together. And if we again look at some images, Keir would have been aware of the wren's nest in Dudley. This is taken again from a set of etchings from 1878, but already that area has been ransacked by the Earls of Dudley for limestone. If we move on. Particularly he was interested in coal because this was the mainstay of industrial prosperity. And of course, he had his own coal mine. He described the area's coal seam, which stretched for 7 miles with an average breadth of 4 miles. The tract of country, he said, is distinguished by a bed of coal of remarkable thickness, generally 10 yards, having been found at such depths as are within the reach of human industry and practical advantage. Keir noted the advantages of the iron ore, limestone and clay deposits, which led to the building of furnaces, forges and foundries, and the manufacture of guns, locks, screws and nails, which he referred to. You can see the interconnection of things. Next slide. He was also aware of the importance of transport. The growth of canals, he argued, stimulated demand outside the area and linked the Black Country to a wider economy. The canals had really only started in the 1760s in the area, linking the Black Country to a wider economy, promoting trade in the seaports of Bristol, Liverpool and Hull. We can say he was writing during what economic historians have called a period of takeoff in the local economy as minerals were exploited, metal industries developed and transport stimulated growth. by enabling resources and products to reach markets outside the West Midlands. Next slide. He also, go back to the previous slide, he also analysed the local geology which underpinned the economy, linked with local limestone deposits and the road mending ragstone, sometimes overlooked, quarried from the Rowley Hills. Coal provided his main focus, as I suggested before, and of course his knowledge of mining was based on his own colliery at Tividale and a consumer of coal. Keir classified the different geological strata in his mine in Tividale, which was a deep mine, and depicted different types of coal, different methods of extraction. Very sophisticated analysis of a single coal mine at the time. Next slide. Again, I've included some of the wonderful etchings by Richard Shattuck later, but there you've got a surface of a coal mine with a horse-drawn gin, which was dying out in 1878, but would have been all too common at the time when Keir was writing. And if we move on, and there's another example of a coal mine. That's where you would have, no doubt, there a Newcomen steam engine, possible a Watt engine, pumping water out of a coal mine. Don't know exactly where that is, but you can see the sort of ransacked landscape which was beginning to feature in the 18th and 19th century. Next slide. So what else did he say? Well, he also noted the importance of new technologies, combining geography, geology, new technology, and he writes, modes have been lately introduced of winding up the coals from the bottom of the pits by small fire engines instead of horses, steam engines that is, and of conveying the coals to the wharfs along iron railroads. Coal production, he noted, had increased massively. If you went back 100 years, some of you might be aware of Plott's Natural History of Staffordshire, which is a very sort of impressionistic natural history, but it does deal with some of the raw materials that could be found in Staffordshire. That recorded that South Staffordshire produced 45,500 tons of coal annually, which was the equivalent, Keir argued, of less than 3 weeks production a century later. So he was observing a sort of massive increase in the production of coal. Next slide. What else did he say? Well, he talked about the family economy. Domestic employment and families' economy was stimulated by this economic growth. As this manufacture requires a very simple apparatus of a small heath, this is sort of nail making or metal bashing of different kinds. The small heath, bellows, anvil, and hammer. It is executed at the workman's own house, to each of which houses a small nailing shop is annexed, where the man with his wife and children can work without going from home, and thus an existence is given to an uncommon multitude of small houses and cottages. He's talking about a domestic economy, which we associate with the Black Country in the 19th century, but he's observing it as being very important in the 18th century. Next slide. But if we move towards some of my sort of final slides, that was Keir's contribution to the Black Country, we can say. But Keir also had a major cultural impact in relation to the Lunar Society. His friend Erasmus Darwin, he advised Darwin on corrections for his poem, The Loves of the Plants, which is basically a sort of botany set to verse. For one of his Lunar Society colleagues, Thomas Day, he wrote a biography, a posthumous biography. For Joseph Priestley, he negotiated and corresponded on air. For Josiah and Thomas Wedgwood, they corresponded on heat and white lead for glazes. For James Watt, Keir helped in developing Watt's copying machine, working to develop the best paper and ink combinations. And Keir and Boulton became quarter partners in Watt's business to manufacture his copying machine. Next slide shows an image of the copying machine. If Watt wasn't known for the steam engine, he'd be known for the copying machine, which was the first commercial copier. You could copy documents on that. Putting it very crudely, it worked a bit like a Bandam machine. Certainly those of you who have been school teachers might remember that sort of structure, but I would say this was a better engineered version. But let's move on. We have some letters. I talked about the destruction of Keir's archives, but obviously letters survive, which Keir wrote to other individuals. I'm not going to worry about reading that out. When this goes online, you can have a look at it. But his writing is pretty clear. Here he's corresponding with James Watt about the death of the Erasmus Darwin in 1802, his great friend. Next slide. But he was less enthusiastic about Matthew Boulton. And when Matthew Robinson Boulton, Matthew Boulton's son, asked both James Watt and James Keir to write obituaries for his father on his father's death, or after his father's death in 1809, James Watt, as you might expect, produced a celebratory account. Matthew Boulton didn't. And it talks about damning with faint praise. And Keir uses his classical knowledge. If we agree with Horace, the Roman scholar, principibus placuisse viris non ultima laus est, i.e. few men have been more entitled to this condemnation. And he then says, to please great men is not the last degree of praise. In other words, what he's saying about Boulton is his ability to suck up to the rich and powerful. And then there was another comment. It cannot be doubted that he was indebted for much of his knowledge to the best preceptor, the conversation of eminent men. In other words, he got a lot of his ideas from talking to others. He wasn't enamored with Boulton's skill or knowledge. Next slide. Well, Keir died in 1820, as I've mentioned, and he was buried at All Saints Parish Church in West Bromwich. That survives, and the next image shows the graveyard. There isn't a surviving grave. Keir left instructions that there be no monument. Now, I haven't looked at the grave records to see if they do indicate where Graves' tomb is. I don't know whether anybody else in the Black Country has. But in a sense, that's probably beside the point. Keir didn't want a memorial. Next slide. So if we're looking at his legacy, we have to not look at physical monuments or look at surviving houses, although in part Aberley House survives, but only in part. I think his contributions to science and technology are considerable. Chemistry, invention, heat experiments, El Dorado, Watt's copying machine, and his significance in supporting other Lunar Society figures. He's very generous with his time. A lot of other members of Lunar Society would patent everything that moved. Keir tended to be more generous and would share his ideas. talked about his contribution to industrial development in the Black Country, the glass industry, the chemical industry, and coal mining. And also, one thing that I'm stressing today, his ability to understand the making of the Black Country, how what we would call a region was created economically, and how you got a combination of geography, transport, geology, family economies, and how this was a potential for growth. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's left with one final image. And I often end my talks on the Black Country with this. This dates from 1866, a wonderful picture from the Illustrated London News of December 1866, which summarizes, well, I wouldn't say necessarily everybody's picture of the Black Country, but a view of the Black Country as Mordor, as a hell. This is meant to be the outskirts of Wolverhampton, for those of you who know Wolverhampton. It's not quite like that now, but you've got desolation in the foreground, worn out coal mines, surviving engine gins, and then a sea of smoke and smog in the background. Well, you could say perhaps Keir contributed to this. Certainly Anna Seward would see him as a contributor to this, but I'm not going to comment about that. Okay, we'll leave it at that. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I can see that some questions have been coming through.